start a recording here and share my screen. Talking about this thing called Redux. What is that? Does anybody have a sense for what this even is, this concept? Got the docs pulled up here for us, by the way. What are we talking about when we talk about Redux?
You said yesterday it was like global state for your whole app.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's a way that we can manage our state for the entire application. So thus far, we've been creating fairly small applications that maybe have 1, 2, 3, and 4 components, things like that. But our applications can also get fairly large, especially if you're working in sort of an enterprise type of situation. So let's see what the docs have to say about this. So it says here it's a predictable state container for JS apps. Okay, predictable being important because we want to make sure that we have a good handle on what the state is for our application at any given point in time. Centralized, so we kind of have our state in one place in our application as opposed to spread out all over the place. Doesn't mean that we can't have more localized state as well, but we do have sort of a central place where we can store things, which is nice. Debuggable, pretty cool. We won't really talk about time traveling today at all because this is more of an introduction. But it's flexible as well. It works with any UI layer, meaning that we could use this with some other library like Vue.js or Angular or whatever. We can use Redux with any of those, but you'll frequently hear about it being used with React. Okay. And you can see down here, there are some other libraries from this same team. We've got React Redux, which we'll be using today. And then there's also this Redux toolkit, which we're not going to get into, but I think this is somewhat of a newer library that people are using along with Redux. Okay, if we go to the FAQ, I don't know, let's skip the FAQ. Let's go to the getting started part. Okay, they're going to tell you about Redux toolkit, and like I said, this this stuff is a little bit on the newer side. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to use the older way of doing things. Actually, it's not like the older way of doing things, but over time, approaches to libraries and ideas morph a little bit. So I want to give you guys sort of the conceptual overview of how this whole thing works, and then we'll put it into play with an example. And that way, if you decide to really dig deeper here and learn more about this, either way, you'll kind of understand how the whole thing fits together. That's sort of the most important thing. The syntax changes over time, obviously. So let's go over here and let's just talk about the basic state of a typical component. So the way that looks, let's say that we've got our component here. It has some sort of state to it. I'll just put that in its own little bubble. And then maybe something happens. So our user interacts with a button or some odd thing, right? Submits a form. And then we need to change the state. So what happens at that point? How do we change the state of our component? What do we do? Anybody here?
Yeah, we click on a button or.
Am I frozen? I feel like I lost everyone.
Yeah, to change state, we react with the web page somehow. Click a button or go to a new route or click on.
Yeah, so let's just call it, we'll call it like some sort of user interaction takes place. Okay. And then what do we do to actually tell React to change what's on screen?
Callback function.
Not necessarily.
When you set a state.
Yeah, we're gonna call some sort of a set state function, right? Depending on what the name of the state was. Set state. Okay. And then React is going to do its part, right? So after we call that, so React is going to update. I'll just put here update UI, which is our user interface. And then we're kind of back at the whole start of this, right? So our state is a certain way. User interacts with that user interface. We call set state, which tells React that, hey, something has changed here. And then React goes ahead and updates the user interface for our user, right? So this cycle just keeps repeating itself. Okay. But now let's say that our application has become a little bit more complex, and I've got a diagram over here to indicate what I mean. We can think of our applications as essentially big trees that have all these different branches coming off of them. And each one of these things might be a component of some sort. So at the top of our component tree, we typically have this app.js, right? This is what's housing everything. And then maybe I've got some different views inside these. So these might be the different routes that are associated with my application, view 1, view 2, view 3. And then within view 3, I might have some additional components inside there. So like component 1, 2, and 3. And then component 2 might even have its own components nested inside of it, right? So we've got this tree happening here. And the question comes, what if I'm holding some state up in here, like in my app.js, and I want to access it all the way down here in my subcomponent? How do we do that? And then the second question that goes with that is, why would I even want to have any state all the way up here at app.js?
In case view 1 and view 2 also need to access it.
Yeah, exactly. So if either one of these guys needs to have access to whatever state I was trying to provide view 3, well, we need to lift it to this next higher level, to app.js, right? Okay, good. So you got the second question there. How about the first one? How do we get state that's up here in the app level down here to subcomponent?
Yeah, keep passing it down.
Got to keep passing it down, right? So we have this app.js needs to pass the state down to view 3. View 3 needs to pass that state down to component 2. And then component 2 needs to pass that state down to subcomponent. So there's a special name that developers have given this, and they call it prop drilling. Okay, so every time I pass this state down, app needs to give that to view 3 as a prop, right? And then view 3 needs to give it to component 2 as a prop. And then component 2 needs to give it to subcomponent as a prop as well. So we're drilling these props all the way down throughout our component tree, which could be a lot more complex than this too, by the way. All right. The issue with that is that we end up giving all these props to these components along the way that have no need or interest in that particular piece of information. So if, for instance, we were storing a user at the top of our component tree and we needed to get access to that user down here in the subcomponent, well, if these two components in the, that are part of the path here have no interest in the user, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to pass it on down the road every step of the way, right? So this is the problem that we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve this problem of I don't want to just drill my props all the way down to the subcomponent level. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just reach out and grab it here from subcomponent without having to bother view 3 and component 2 with that information that it doesn't need, right? Questions about this? All right, let's take a look at an example. In the browser, I've got this little app that I've made, super simple, kind of contrived, but something that you guys probably see a lot on web applications these days. We have this ability to turn on dark mode. Okay, and I've got 3 little buttons that'll do the exact same thing. I can click on this one here, that'll turn it on. Now they all say turn it off. I can click on any one to do this operation, right? And let's take a peek at how this code actually works, the way that it is currently. So here's how I have it set up. We'll start at app.js. So my app.js is bringing in some styles. I'll show you what this looks like real quick. I've used something kind of nifty here called custom CSS properties. And if you guys haven't come across these yet, they're pretty neat. They enable us to kind of create variables for our CSS. And a lot of times you'll hear these referred to as CSS variables. So what this does is it allows me to establish some styles for when dark mode is engaged, and then also some values for when light mode is engaged. And then I can, for any one of my particular classes, I can use whatever the value is depending on, you know, whether dark mode is engaged or not. Okay. So var just means we're obtaining the value in this particular context. So if I'm inside of a .dark div, if I'm wrapped in a dark class somewhere, then the dark styles will be applied. Okay, then inside this app.js, we also have our regular app div here, and then I've got a little container component here. So let's see what container is doing. Container has imported this thing called toggle button. And then my container is storing some state here. So I've got dark mode, set dark mode, so forth. And then I've got this little toggle dark mode function. So notice what this function is doing. It's calling set dark mode. And this is kind of interesting. What's going on here? Anybody ever called a setter function like that?
That's just you like toggling it on and off, right? Like setting it to the opposite of it.
Yeah, we did that in I think to-do list.
Yeah, same kind of idea. What's interesting here, though, is that I've passed a callback function as opposed to just creating whatever I want the new value to be, which would be something like this, right? I would literally just pass in the opposite of whatever dark mode is. What the callback function does is it ensures that the next value is based on whatever the current value is. Most of the time, this would not even be an issue. But whenever you're deriving your state based on some previous state, it's the safest to do it like this, to pass in a callback function as opposed to just passing in a new value.
So is that just across the board, like the safest way to do that, or is that Redux specific?
Across the board.
Okay.
Yeah, because none of this has any Redux to it yet. We're gonna add
Okay.
that. Okay, and then I've got so inside here we've got some toggle buttons, of course. Notice here that I'm passing in some information as props. So we have to give our toggle button access to whether or not dark mode is engaged. And then we also have to give it some ability to handle our clicks, right? And that's what this is right here. We're taking in those props. When the button is clicked on, we're going to handle the click. And then this is just a little ternary here indicating whether dark mode is engaged or not. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to be able to not have to pass in that information to my toggle button. I want this to look something like this. Toggle button doesn't need to take in any props. It's able to get all of the data that it needs. Okay. So if we want to do that, let's introduce some additional dependencies to our project. I'm going to open up the terminal here. I'm just going to install a couple things. Actually, hold on. Let me switch to a different branch here. So right now I'm on the main branch. I'm going to check out -B, which means I'm creating a new branch right here, and we'll call this our Redux branch. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to install these dependencies. So I'm going to do npm install. The dependencies that we want are going to be Redux and then React Redux, which enables us to connect Redux to React. Okay. And while that's installing, let's go ahead and get it set up somewhere in our project. So Redux, being a global state management solution, or typically used that way, I would say we could probably get it set up here in index.js, because this is kind of like the highest level in our application. And there are a couple things that we're going to need to do here. So the first is we're going to have some app state stored inside here. And I'll put a little note here. Our app state will be a plain JS object. Okay, it's just going to be an object that has some key value pairs in it. And so let's create that. I'm going to just call this initial state. I'm going to create an object here that has some different key value pairs for the things that we want. So for us, we're going to say dark mode is going to have a value of false. So when the person first loads up the app, dark mode will be set to false, right? I'm going to put a couple other things in here, which we won't really mess with today, but just to show you that your app state could have a bunch of other things in it. Well, maybe I'd also have a user in my application. Maybe that'll be null to start with. We could also have something like a shopping cart. Okay, so maybe it would be a cart that would have a total 0, and then it would have just like an array of items that starts out empty, something like that. Okay. So this is sort of like how our global state will start off when a person first loads this up. Now, we need to connect this state somehow with our application. And to do that, I'm going to import a couple things from Redux here. So let's import something called create store from Redux. Okay, and this is a function that we're going to need to use in order to actually establish this application state that we've got here. Now notice here that I'm doing all of this stuff in index.js. That's simply for simplicity's sake. On a bigger app, you definitely wouldn't have all of this stuff in index.js, but I just want you guys to kind of see how it all works. Okay, now we've got this function up here called create store, and we have this initial state. So let's try to create what's called a store, and the store is where we're storing all of this application state. So I'm going to create a constant variable called store, set that equal to create store. Okay, now let's look at what this function takes in. It's telling us it's taking in some kind of a reducer. Ooh, what's a reducer? Anyone heard of that before? Anyone check the optional assignment in the platform use reducer at all?
It's just like a different way to uh, sort of get the same functionality as Redux.
Yeah,
It's like state with sub values or something along those lines.
yeah, you could think of it that way. So whenever we want to manage some sort of complex state that has more than one piece to it, a reducer function can come into play. And actually, use reducer was inspired by Redux itself. So this concept was a Redux thing that was then sort of brought into the main React library. Okay, so what a reducer does, its job is to, and I'm just going to create a function called reducer. This could be called whatever we like, but I'm just going to keep it simple and call it that, is to take some existing state and an action, and we'll talk about what an action is shortly, and then calculate a new state based on these two things. It takes these two things and it's supposed to return out a brand new state after. Okay. So much like what, actually, let me go back here. Much like what this is doing, this is taking in our current state and it's calculating our new state, right? That's all that's doing. But the reducer is doing it on sort of a larger level because, as you guys can see here, our state has multiple parts to it. So we need to take whatever the state is currently and modify it in some way. And I'll just put here to do, right? We'll flesh this out. Okay, so what we want to do when we're creating the store is we need to pass in this reducer function. So let's just pass this in. And then there should be an optional second argument here where we could pass in the initial state, I believe. Hopefully this will work. Unless the API has changed a lot, in which case I might have to make a modification here. Okay. So let me just make a note, say what this is. This is our global app store. Okay. Now the question is, how do I give my application access to the store? So we have this store, but it's not yet connected to our tree just yet, our component tree. And that's where that other library that we installed called React Redux comes into play. So I'm going to need to import something from there. Import provider from React Redux. Okay. Anybody go through the context API section of the platform? Anybody look at that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is actually going to use that same concept. We're using the context API here. And the way that we do that is we have our app component right here. We're going to wrap it with this provider component right here. So I'm going to wrap with component. Okay, I've got this provider component now. And what I need to do is I need to give it a reference to my store here. This is the store that we created on line 25. Connect our store to the app. Okay. So now let's make sure that everything's working. What I want to do is I want to connect the class up here. Hang on a second here. So my container has a class that's derived based on whatever the status of my dark mode is. Okay. So if we're switching over to React here, or I'm sorry, Redux, it means that we need to base this value on whatever the global state of the app is now, not just this local state that we were using before, right? So I'm going to comment this out for now. I'm also going to get rid of some of this here so that each one of these toggle buttons doesn't have that. And in order for me to figure out whether dark mode is engaged or not, I need to get some information from Redux. Okay. So let's comment this out. We're no longer using state from React here. I'm going to import a function here from React Redux. It's called useSelector. What does that mean if it sounds like that? useSelector, what does that kind of tell us? Anybody know what that means when we see a function like that, useSelector? Special kind of function, right? What kind? This is a hook. Every time you see a function name like this, use something or other, that means it's a hook. At least that's the convention in React. Okay. And when we call this particular hook, we have to tell it what part of the state we're interested in. Well, here, whoops, I went to the wrong thing. The part of the state that I'm interested in here is this key, this dark mode key. Okay. So if I were here, I can access that like this, like if I were to just do console.log initial state dot dark mode, that would tell me whatever the value of dark mode was at this point in time, and it should be false, right? To access that inside here, we have to give this useSelector hook a callback function that will take in the global act state and that will return the value of dark mode. Any questions on this? So reaching out to the global state. Okay, this is us sort of like reaching our hand up and seeing if we can grab this global value.
So that's not changing the value yet. That's just grabbing it.
Correct.
Cool.
Yep, exactly. So let's see if that's working. I'm going to go back to my app here, and in the console, whoops, let me refresh. Uh-oh. Can't find something. What did I do wrong? Oh, shoot. I'm running into this issue again. Do you guys remember when I ran into this last week? Babel loader? Why is it doing that to me? Okay. Let me npm install save dev Babel loader. Sorry about that. Okay, and while we're waiting for that to happen, I'm going to tweak my button a little bit as well. So right now, um, we're actually grabbing this from props. At least we were trying to grab it from props, but I'm no longer passing it into my toggle button. Notice my toggle button doesn't have any props. So I need to access that, that dark mode some other way. Well, we can do it the exact same way. We can import this use selector function again, which again is a hook, use selector from React Redux. And to get the value from that, it's going to be the same process. So I'm going to say const dark mode equals the result of calling the use selector hook with this callback function that takes in the state and returns out the dark mode value. Okay, so instead of me doing this based on props.enabled, I can now just base it on this dark mode right here. So let me tweak this, dark mode. Refresh this here. Can't read property dark mode of undefined. Uh-oh. I think I might have made a small little mistake here. Let me just try to tweak this. So with our initial state, I'm going to pass this in as the default value for the state in our reducer. And I think that will fix the issue that we're running into here. So if I say the default value here is initial state, then I no longer have to pass this in like that. So let's try this. Can't read property dark mode of undefined. Okay. So what does that mean, guys?
The dark mode is not set to false or true.
No. What's undefined here? State itself, right? So yeah, let me make sure the signature on this function is correct. So when we create our reducer function, we're taking in this initial state and taking in an action. Let me just try to return state from this for now. I think maybe that's the issue because I believe it runs this reducer function on the app load, and that's why it's telling us the state is undefined. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we know that these are working, but then of course, if I click on any one of these, it's not going to do anything for me, right? Okay, so now what we need to do is we have to handle the clicks here so that we can update this global state. So first thing I'm going to do is I have this props.handle click, which of course we're no longer passing down at all. And I need to do something kind of special here. So normally we would just call a setter function, but when we're using Redux, we need to update the state in a slightly different way. So let me just make a note up here. When updating Redux state, we have to dispatch an action. All right, and these terms sound kind of technical and frightening or whatever, but it's not really a big deal. Redux is going to give us a function called dispatch that we can use, and an action is just going to be a regular JavaScript object. That's all it is. Okay. So in order for us to get access to this dispatch function here, we have to do something special here. Use dispatch. So I'm importing an additional hook from React Redux. Okay. Then when I invoke that function here, when I say use dispatch, it's going to give me back another function here called dispatch. So put a note here, returns a function called dispatch, which allows us to update the state. Okay. So what I want to do here is I want to create a little callback function. My callback function is going to use dispatch. So we're going to say dispatch here. And then what we said was an action is just a basic JavaScript object. Okay. So the basic JavaScript object is just going to look like this. Each action is going to have a type. Okay, and our types will oftentimes, you'll see it in other applications and tutorials and things, you'll see the casing looks something like this. Toggle dark mode. See how it sort of looks like a constant there? This is the type of thing that we're trying to do. Sometimes our actions will also have something that you'll see referred to as a payload. It might also have some data that comes along with it. In our case, we don't really need any data because we're just simply turning that on or off. But if I was doing something like logging in a user, the payload might be the actual user data that I was trying to put in my app store at that time. Okay, so again, we call this dispatch function, and then the dispatch needs to be passed a plain JavaScript object that has some sort of type of action that we're trying to kick off, and then potentially some data that goes along with it. In this case, we don't have any data. Any questions so far? All right, so I'm going to get rid of these props since we're not using these right now. Shoot. Okay, and then the final thing is we need to be able to update our state whenever somebody dispatches an action of this type, right? Whenever somebody tries to toggle the dark mode, well, we need to toggle that dark mode. So now we come back to this reducer function that we created over here. And the job of this function, again, is to take whatever our current state is and whatever action has been passed here, and then just calculate out the new state. So this should calculate new app state. We won't modify the existing state directly. Okay. So again, in keeping with this sort of functional programming paradigm, we're not just going to mutate this state object here. We're going to create a whole new state object. So oftentimes the way that you'll see this done is through the use of a switch statement. So a switch statement, and we could do it a different way too if you guys find this to be a little bit confusing. if I switch it based on the type of action that I get, I can provide some different cases. So if the action type is toggle dark mode, then what I want to do is I want to return a new state object that has all of my existing state in it. That's what the dot 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 means, right? We're taking everything that's currently inside the state and we're putting it inside this new object. And then my dark mode will be state. It will be the opposite of whatever the current dark mode value is. So notice here that I'm returning this brand new state object, which is it's connected to this, our initial state, taking everything that was in there so far, and then I'm just merely replacing the dark mode value. All right, stop me if anything's getting confusing. This should, in theory, work now. Oh, there we go. All right, so let me just recap this real quick. So in our container, we decided to get rid of some of this state that we were storing locally. It was being stored locally in the container component. And we decided we were going to store it at a higher level, which in this case was happening in our index.js, essentially the highest level for our application. We wrapped our app component with this provider component. The provider has a reference to our store, which again is just like it's the global place where we're hanging on to our state. Our store had some interesting stuff going on. So we had some initial state. This is just how things are going to be when the app first loads up. We also had this reducer function, which takes whatever the current state is and some action that we give to it, and it then creates an updated state, not by mutating, but by creating a brand new object here. And that brand new object is spreading across all the key values that are in the state currently. And then we're just tweaking the value that we're interested in. In order for us to grab a reference to the state at any point in our application, we were able to use this special hook that React Redux gives us called useSelector. And when we call that hook, we need to provide a callback function which reaches into the state and grabs the particular property that we're looking for, which is dark mode here. And now what's cool about this is that I can do this from any point in my application. So if I were way down deep in the component tree, I no longer need to worry about giving state that's stored up here at a higher level and passing it all the way down to all these intermediaries. I can merely use my useSelector down here in my subcomponent to go grab a reference to whatever's being stored at that higher level.
Worley, can you show how you ID'd that as toggle dark mode? I
Yes.
believe in one of the components again.
So that's right here. So when we click on that button, I've created this inline callback function. What the callback function does is it calls this special function dispatch, which we got a reference to up here on line 8. And then we passed in just a plain JavaScript object. So the object is going to say what type of action this is, what type of thing we're trying to do. And then if there's some data associated with that action, then we could pass it in here as well.
I know you mentioned that this could potentially be how like a shopping cart works on an
Mhm.
e-commerce website.
Yeah, so
If that's
let's see what that would look like actually. I'll just show you guys for example what that might look like. So what if the case were add we'll call it like add cart item or something like that. Well, what I might do is I would return the state. And then the only thing that we're changing here would be the shopping cart, right? This is where it gets a little bit tough to read, at least as far as the way that Redux used to be used. But when I was looking at the docs in the last couple of days, it seems like they're recommending sort of a different approach these days. So keep that in mind. State shopping cart. Notice here I'm sort of spreading at two different levels, which is, I don't know. Now, actually, maybe we can update both those things, right? We're going to update the total and update the items. So let's just do this instead. We'll say total is now going to be the state dot shopping cart dot total. What would I add to that? Probably the action. So the payload would probably be the item that I'm actually trying to add to the cart. And that item likely would have some sort of a price property connected to it, right? Now, if I'm trying to add this item to the cart, well, that might look something like this. State. And then it would be action.payload. So I'm taking all the existing elements that are in my shopping cart, and then I'm just tacking on this additional item at the end. And this could be tweaked as well. If you didn't want to call it payload, we could also just call it item for simplicity. It could be like that add cart item has a property called item, which is the actual product item that we're trying to add.
and you can pass that whole item object through the payload.
Exactly. So if we were doing that, it would be something like this item, and then the item would probably be some sort of an object that had, you know, the price 5, name, some item name.
And theoretically, if you had mapped out all of these buttons through like your list of items, you could just add in the different like JSX pieces of that into item there.
Yeah, exactly. If we were mapping through a list of items and we wanted to grab a specific item, well, we could just pass that in directly here, right? In the object.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, the use case being that if you're doing some sort of an e-commerce thing, well, somewhere deep in a product page, maybe you're going to have a component that would be like an add to cart button. And now we don't have to worry about passing those props all the way down to that add to cart button. We can just have the add to cart button dispatch an action and take care of it. All right. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
So so all of these states are held locally on the client side, right?
Client side, correct.
And so if we were considering, this might be just too big, but if we were considering adding the login and registration, their user ID would be kept in state, right?
Yes.
And then what would are we allowed to grab items from the state and then save them into our database? Or how would we kind of do that? So like if they were logged in and then logged out, we would want to clear the cart but save their cart, right? So would we be able to pull the cart and then send it back to the database to save it for next time?
Yeah, you'd probably want to. At least all the big e-commerce, all the big e-commerce players are typically saving the carts to the database. You could technically save the cart to something more short term, like a session. But if you really wanted the best experience, you'd probably want to save it to the DB. That way, when they come back and they log back in, you can just retrieve it for them.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So all of this stuff is strictly speaking front end. And if you wanted to, what you would probably do if you were creating this sort of front end, back end paradigm like we're talking about, is rather than just dispatching this action directly like this, well, we would make a server side call first. And then if the server says, hey, this has been properly added to the cart, at that point, we would dispatch the action to Redux. Because you really want your client side to be reflective of what's happening on the server side. If those two things go out of sync, well, then the person using the app is thinking, hey, I just added that thing to my cart, but when they refresh the page, if they do a hard reload or they close the browser and come back, it's totally been lost, right? If you have not made that server side call.
And then, so just a quick follow-up question.
Mhm.
So if we did do log out, is it possible to just do like state to initial state to reset it on logout so it goes back to the initial state in the index?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you could have a logout action, for instance. Say we had a logout action. What you would do probably is you would return this new object that goes across the state, sets the user back to null. And then if you wanted to reset the shopping cart entirely, well, you could do all of that stuff, right? So total would now be 0, and then items would be an empty array again.
Okay. So, but are we not allowed to just do return initial state, or has initial state been erased by that point?
No, it still exists in memory.
So would we need to retype in all that stuff, or can we just do initial state? Is kind of what I was
Yeah,
asking.
you'd probably want to just spread across it. So in keeping with sort of the functional nature of this, you just do something like this.
Okay, perfect. Gotcha. Okay.
Morley, this might be kind of similar to Daniel's question there. If you're passing the user through or like an item through on the on click in the toggle button component, since that's technically like a DOM element, would you be able to manipulate like a price if it was in there? Or like a user password or something like that, like would you be able to?
Do you mean that in kind of like a nefarious way, or do you mean could you manipulate it in such a way that you as the app developer wanted?
Sorry, like from a security standpoint, is that something we would need to be aware of in the build? Like you would see all that on click in the cons or in the like inspect.
Yeah.
Right. So if there was an object there, technically you could get in there and like manipulate the DOM.
Sure. I mean, we could even do that anywhere. So if I open up my inspect tools here, I could change any of this text, right? So if it said like the price was something or other, and that price was somewhere encoded in a form, then I could alter it very easily, right? So I think that's kind of what you're getting at. And
Yeah, like what's a workaround so that that's not
So
doable there?
yeah, so the key is this. You don't want to base what you're presenting as the state to the user. You don't want to base that on what he or she is potentially manipulating on the client side. You want to base it on whatever the server says is right. So if they try to add an item to their cart, for instance, you don't take their word for it what the price was. You check on the back end to make sure that, you know, here's the price for this item at the time that they added it. And that's the actual price that you associate with the item, not whatever is coming from the DOM, because that, you know, keep in mind that could be changed very easily.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so remember that your backend is like ultimately your source of truth, your single source of truth.
You also mentioned that in like a bigger app, we wouldn't do that in the index.js. We would do that somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
What's
Yeah, so
kind of the common?
depending on the structure. When I was looking in the docs the other day, they had some kind of interesting structures presented there. I would say just glance around at that and see what they're saying. Trying to think where they mentioned here. It would kind of depend on the app that you're working on, you know, depending on how they had structured everything. But they might have a folder that would be housing all the Redux stuff, like a folder that was holding the different reducer functions and that sort of thing.
Cool, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. So in our case, we have one reducer function that's kind of taking care of the entire state. But a simpler way of doing this is where you kind of break the state out into different, they're calling it in the docs now slices, like slices of the state. And that enables you to simplify and write functions that are only dealing with sort of one part of the state as opposed to dealing with the whole state. Because see, when we do it this way, every time we return the state again, we always have to spread across whatever's in it at the current time, right? So that I don't lose my user and I don't lose my shopping cart and so forth. But there are ways now that you can split the state up into smaller chunks that makes it a little bit easier to deal with. And all that stuff's in the docs as well. But at its core, so all I wanted you guys to really get is that at its core, what we're doing here with Redux is, again, very similar to what we did with a regular app. We have our state only, whoa, sorry about that. We have our state, only it's kind of at a global level. And then we have some sort of user interaction taking place, right? So I'll just call this UI int action. Okay, and then when that user interaction happens, then we are dispatching an action. The action is then given to the reducer function. And then the reducer's function job is to return us out a brand new state. That's all that's happening there.